A very good morning to all participants in this webinar. Welcome to the Singapore Sports School NYSI Multisport Academy Parent Engagement Session. Thanks for your time on a Saturday morning. And as participants continue to stream in, we have among us staff and parents and hopefully children who are listening in. And as the numbers of participants increase, let's wait for maybe half a minute more before I take you through some admin instructions. By the way, I am Kok Wei. As you can see, I'm one of the general managers from Singapore Sports School. 30 seconds more. Once again, a very good morning to all participants of this webinar. A substantial number of participants are all in our midst now. Let me take you through some simple admin instructions. Let's have a look at the second slide. Now, all of you are currently in a Zoom webinar. Now, during this webinar, attendees, you are automatically muted and your video has been disabled. However, you can participate by asking questions throughout the webinar using the Q&A function. So you can just click on the Q&A icon. It's located among the webinar controls at the bottom of the window, and then you can type in your question. These questions are visible by all attendees as well as the host and the speakers. Your name will also appear next to the question. Other attendees, you may choose to upvote the question if you have a desire for it to be answered. We will attempt to answer all or most, if not all, the questions, either by typing in the answers, and many questions will also be addressed during the Q&A segment. So once again, welcome to those who are streaming in. And without further ado, we have got a couple of presenters. Let's start with Assistant Director Sports, Mr. Mike Goh. Mr. Mike Goh, please.
Hi, a very good morning to all of you. Okay, so I think we will just start the seminar, in the webinar straight away, because I know that actually there may be still some participants coming in, but I think to respect the time for all of you, so I'll just go on first. But of course, any point, as what my colleague Mr. Ng has mentioned, you may type in your questions in the chat, the Q&A box, and we will attempt to address the questions towards the end. So keep the questions coming, but but do follow through the presentation first, because I believe you may find some answers in this presentation. Okay, so once again, a very good morning. So I believe actually most of you here would have actually attended our open house back in April. So I will just do perhaps a quick introduction of what Sports School is and actually what are the offerings that we have before we go into my colleague will actually take over and then share a little bit more about why multisport before I come back in again to tell you about what this program actually offers your child. Okay, so as Sports School, many of you will be familiar. I mean, it is the only sports school in Singapore, and our mission is really to groom every student athlete who join us to become a champion. And our mission, of course, as I said, is we are actually looking for students who aspire to be national athletes and provide them with the best environment possible to groom them to eventually become national champions. So our mission as well is in the journey, we actually want to nurture learned champions with character. And this means that it is not just about the sports, but ensure that alongside as they grow in their sports, we make sure that their academic progresses as well. And also they build a strong character. And of course, along the way, we hope to instill in them the values of respect, integrity, responsibility, excellence, and resilience. So what do I mean by champions? So a lot of you naturally will say champions is like, oh yes, I win the medals in some competitions. But that is not the only focus of sports school. As mentioned, we really want to nurture champions, and we talk about champions in sports, We also want to nurture champions for sports, people who are advocates, who eventually in the long term, they may be sportsmen, champions as well. They may be representing the country, but yet at the same time, they are actually advocates for people, for the sports industry in general. Okay, and of course, the other aspect is really want to nurture champions in life, and these are people who have the strong character and display the values to go around championing and then helping perhaps the less fortunate around them, helping their friends and peers around them to support them in their respective journey. So, what is sports school? What does sports school offer? So this slide shows a broad overview of the of sports school's value proposition. Okay, when we talk about sports, we really want to in their journey with us. We really want to help them maximize their sporting potential, and this is done through having a quality sports development and performance support program. And when I talk about performance support, I will share more a bit later about the partnership that we have with the various agencies and organizations. Okay. Of course, when I mentioned earlier, champions, we talk about fulfilling educational aspirations, about learned champions. So that's when actually we do not forget that actually we are also looking after the academic progress of your child. And that's where we actually have in place both a secondary and post-secondary program. And all these programs are customized, tailored to the student to ensure that they are athlete friendly. Okay. I will share more on this in the later slides. And of course, what I mentioned earlier, last part about holistic development, to groom them to be resilient and future-ready citizens, as well as having a good character and leadership. So some of you will be familiar. I'm not sure whether any of you actually has been to sports school. Actually, we are located in the north in Woodlands, and these are the facilities. I mean, just a sampling of the facilities that we have. Essentially, what the point is that actually we are very much how to say we actually have the series of facilities that actually is able to support a variety of sports to ensure that the students are well equipped and well supported in their journey to become national athletes. So what does sports school offer? Okay, so in a way we look after both, as I mentioned, both academic as well as the sports angle. And we, although sports school, you may say that, hey, what do I need to come into sports school? In terms of academics, is there a minimum PSLE AL score? Things like that. But actually, sports school, our focus is actually on grooming national sports person. So we actually offer all courses, both from the express, normal tech, and normal academic courses. And to ensure that actually, regardless of where your academic ability lies, if you are able to join the sports school based on your sports, we will ensure our best to put forth our best support to make sure that they do not fall back in their academic development as well. And when it comes to sports, we also take a very customized approach because we recognize that different athletes at different point in time, they require different levels of support. So for instance, when they first join sports school, many of them may be at the school sports level. You may have represented your primary school, the child may have represented primary school in school sports, or they may be actually participating in multiple activities, not necessarily at the school level yet, perhaps, but they are actually doing and being very active in various sports. And that's where they come in generally at what we call the school sports level. And of course, as they progress in their respective sport, with the support of the coaches, the sports scientists, as well as the academic mentors to help them progress to the next level. And then slowly as they progress up to the national youth level and eventually to the national team level. So at sports school, in terms of their sports development, we already adopt a long-term athletic development approach. So at this stage where your child is actually coming into the secondary school program, right? So perhaps at primary school, through the MOE system, the PE curriculum, as well as your own parents, of course, you have been sending your kids to various activities, perhaps. Your child actually would have already built strong fundamental movement skills, and that puts them in a good state to become to go on this journey to become a serious sports person in the long term. And as they join sports school, these are the phases they generally go through, where they learn to train, how to go through a sustained training schedule with higher intensity. And then, of course, slowly as they learn, go through the phase, they will really train to train even harder. as they progress up the ladder, as I mentioned earlier, to the national youth sports level. And eventually, they will be learning how to compete at the perhaps both the local and the international stage. So this is one of the, in terms of athletes development support, that's where actually we actually have, very fortunate to have various agencies and organizations on the journey with us. And of course, one of them is National Youth Sports Institute, where it provides a lot of support services such as even strength conditioning, mental skills development, where the team of staff from the National Youth Sports Institute will journey alongside sports school coaches to ensure that each of your child, as they develop in their journey to become a sports person, sports athlete, they will actually be well looked after. Okay. So of course, when we say that to become a wholesome, in a way, a sports person, they just not need to be the best in their sports in terms of their ability, but essentially we also try to instill in them or educate them about what it takes to become a sports person, because eventually when they become they go up become higher level sports person, they actually would need to take into account and understand a lot of these aspects, such as fundamentals of sports science, even sports nutrition, what best to eat, and support as they lead up to certain competitions. So these are they see all our lower sec students will actually go through various modules which will actually educate them in these aspects. Now, moving on to the academic program. So you may be familiar that at sports school, we don't just offer a secondary school program. So most of you in this chat will actually be parents of primary 6 students, and this is our main target group for today. But I know that some of you may actually be perhaps considering your child for future enrollment. Your child may be currently in P5, P4, but do know that actually once you join sports school, we do offer our secondary school program, as well as 3 post-secondary programs in the IBTP, and as well as our poly diploma programs with Republic Poly and Ngee Poly. So this slide may look a bit cluttered. I'll hang on here for a while, but essentially what it means that for sports school, today, although I'm addressing you mainly to recruit students into the Multisport Academy for at the secondary 1 level, but do note that actually sports school, we actually offer multiple points of entry for various levels of students. And once they graduate from primary school, essentially they can move within the system to join sports school anytime, as long as they aspire to become national athletes, and then and sports school is deemed to be the best fit for them. In terms of academic support, which I mentioned earlier, rest assured that because we know that as sports person, as they grow, as they develop, they do need to have, for example, they sometimes need to go for competitions, both in the national schools or even overseas. And that's when the academic support needs to be very customized and flexible. And that's where, for instance, students may need to take a leave of absence from school. They need to do makeup classes or even makeup exams. So this is where sports school provide that learning environment with a strong team of teachers and mentors to support your child and guide them and advise them as well to basically plot their path on how to become, as they grow in the journey to become an elite sports person. So in terms of sports school, you might also know that actually sports school actually offers a boarding environment. So because sports school essentially is a all-in-one facility where sports school students, some of them may have morning training and sometimes evening or even night training. And that's where the boarding environment actually supports them very well. Essentially, you just need to hop over to training. In the morning, they'll go over for lessons, afternoon training, and then go back into the boarding environment. And this actually saves them a lot of time. But beyond just time management, it actually helps to mold them into become independent learners, because essentially they are away from family for most part of the week. And that's when they interact with their peers, they form new habits, they need to take on their own responsibilities, for example, to clean their rooms. And that's actually help to mold them as they journey from a teenage to become adults. So these are some of the services that actually are provided in the boarding environment. Okay. So where we actually ensure that we work with the NYSI sports nutritionists to ensure that the meals and nutrition are properly looked after, ensure they get their appropriate rest and nutrition to support them in their journey. Of course, the other services like laundry, safety and security, it's all well looked after. So not to worry if your child decides to come into sports school and stay in our boarding. And beyond that, actually, because the sports school, I mentioned sports school students, actually they spend a large part of their time training. So there's a time that's set aside for the students through the supervised self-study time for students to be able to catch up on schoolwork even in the evenings to ensure that they do not lose out. Okay. So this is a sample of the daily schedule. Okay. Of course, it varies from different sports to sport, okay, which I'll share a little bit more later. Okay. So for instance, in the morning, some of the academies may have morning training. Then they go through the usual breakfast, lessons, and lunch. And that's when they come back again in the afternoon for training, eventually before going back into the boarding environment for their evening program. Okay, so then I guess this is the part that is set to get a bit more targeted to what you are really here for today, which you will be familiar that actually sports school over the years, we have currently actually offering 9 academy programs as well as an individual program. Essentially, the 9 academy programs which you see on the screen, which these are the academies where once you join, you essentially choose a sport, for instance, badminton, and you focus on badminton in your journey in sports school. For individual programs, similarly, it caters to a variety of sports such as cycling, gymnastics, silat. These are students who may not be able to train in sports school. For instance, we do not have for the coaches. We do not necessarily have the facilities, for instance. This is where the athletes actually work very closely with the various national sports associations to develop their training program, and sports schools support them in the area of academic as well as boarding environment. You will see at the bottom of the screen, that's where the Multisport Academy, this is the new academy that we will be launching for the upcoming, for the 2023 Sec 1 intake. Okay. So perhaps then now let me just go on to just do a quick overview of what the Multisport Academy is about. So as I mentioned, we are now looking for current P6s to join us for the new Sec 1 intake. The focus, as I mentioned earlier, is really on this concept of philosophy of long-term athletic development. It is slightly different from the other academies. Okay, essentially, when your child comes in, he or she will not be just focusing on one sport throughout their journey in sports school. Instead, when they first join us, we will actually provide them broad-based training through a number of sports. And the focus of this is really not so much it's really focusing on the acquisition and strengthening of their skills. As I mentioned earlier, your child should already have been exposed and proficient in the fundamental movement skills. And that's where through this program, they actually hope to put together all these skills and then train them to be more adaptive and strengthen their skills so that eventually when they are able to, when they specialize in the sport in the later stage, they actually are able to maximize their potential. So perhaps at this point, I will hand over to my colleague from NYSI, Mr. Matthew, to actually share a bit more about why multisports. Okay. Matthew, over to you.
Thank you, Mike. Good morning, everybody. We wanted to take a bit of time during today's sharing to answer the question, why multisport? Because some of you may be wondering why, after so many years with the sports cooperation, why have we decided at this juncture to bring in the Multisport Academy? So I'll just talk you through some of the more recent developments in the field of athlete development, and hopefully that can provide a bit more context as to why we are putting the Multisport Academy in at this point. If we go to the next slide, please. So I think many of you might be familiar with the 10,000 hour rule that become quite well known maybe about 10 years ago through the Malcolm Gladwell book. And that was based on some earlier research by someone called Ericsson. And he was looking at things like violin playing and chess playing. And he come to this finding that elite performers would need 10,000 hours of what he called deliberate practice. What's been found in subsequent research is that actually there's actually quite a lot of deviation within that. So for some people, they will reach expert performance in as little as 2,000 hours. Some will take as many as 20,000 hours, and some will never reach that level of performance no matter how many hours they put in. So actually the understanding around this has changed. And actually for the majority of high performers, when we actually look into their background, actually what they have done is had a much more diverse experience at a younger age, and they only tend to then specialize in one discipline or one sport around their late adolescence. So while we are probably familiar with the stories of Tiger Woods or the Williams sisters, who are those who did start their sport very young, in fact, what we've found is that they are very much the minority, and actually much more elite performers would have gone through this early diversification pathway. Probably a prominent one would be someone like Roger Federer, who at a young age participated in many different sports, actually wasn't that interested in tennis, and only started in tennis comparatively late and then developed very quickly. For those who are interested to learn more, there's a book called Range, which came out a few years ago by David Epstein, which does talk about this in a lot more detail. So I won't go into a huge amount of detail now, but just to provide sort of the broad context of how our understanding of athlete development has changed over the last 10 years. Next slide, please. And sort of linked to that is this idea that the early prediction isn't actually very predictive. So this was some work done in Germany looking at football academies. And what they found is that those players who were selected early, so the under 11s, only 9% of those were still in the system at the under 19s, and actually 0 were in the system at under 21s. You see, similarly, for those who were selected at under 13, only 14 of those were still in the academy at under 19. So you see that actually by the under 21 stage, the majority of the players within the academy weren't selected early at all. They'd come through much later. And there's a number of reasons for this. Obviously, children would develop at different stages. Some will be born at the start of the year. So in our context, those born January, February, March do have an advantage over those born in November and December, because they're effectively a year older within the academic cycle. Also, we have people who are just naturally early developers or late developers. So if you are an early developer, then you might get selected in this context of the under 11 or under 13 stage, but eventually all the other players will catch up and they will also develop. And then maybe where you've relied on your physical attributes earlier on, while the later developers have had to focus more on their skills. And eventually when the later developers overtake the early developer, they're at a disadvantage. So that's what we see in this sort of context. So what we want to make sure is there is multiple entry opportunities into the system for potential athletes who've either developed later or maybe just haven't had the opportunities earlier. So haven't been able to train to the same volume at an earlier stage. We want to make sure there are opportunities for them to come into the system throughout the whole development pathway. Next slide, please. So again, so looking at some of the other high performance systems. So there was a study done around the 2012 Olympic Games, which is called the Great British Medalist Project. And they looked at their super elite athletes. So athletes who had won multiple gold medals at the Olympics or World Championships. And they found, again, consistent with the earlier research, actually, very few of them followed this 10,000 hours rule, with the majority of them participating in a lot of different sports during childhood and early adolescence, and then only specializing in their chosen sport at that later adolescent stage. So maybe 15, 16, 17 years old is when they really specialize in that one sport. Next slide, please. And a similar study was conducted in Germany. So they compared their world-class athletes, so those who won medals at the World Championships or Olympic Games, versus their national level athletes. And they looked into their background to try and understand what were some of the differences in their development pathways. So the first chart at the top looks at the number of training sessions they had during that period in their main sport. And you see that between the world-class athletes and national events, there's actually very little between them. The number of sessions they participated in their primary sport was very, very similar. The only thing that really differentiated them was the second chart, which is the other sports they participated in. So those who went on to become world-class athletes had spent more time participating in other sporting activities at a younger age. So what that tells us is that exposure to other sports potentially helps guard against injury, and also helps create skills that are then transferable into the main sport. And that is likely the reason why these athletes were able to go on to be world-class athletes, where their compatriots who were at a similar level and obviously participated in the similar amount of training in their main sport were not able to make that transition to world-class status. Next slide, please. And finally, in Australia, they also looked at their Olympians. So they did a study of their Olympic athletes, and they looked at their development pathways, and they found that actually only few of them went through what we'd call a pure or non-linear pathway, or pure ascent pathway. I'll explain these terms in the coming slides, but what that effectively means is that from the majority of the athletes, they did not specialize early, that they spent time participating in other sports and only then specialized in the sport they wanted to be successful in at a much later stage. So if we go into the subsequent slides, I'll talk through this in a bit more detail. So again, as we talk about these three pathways, so your linear ascent pathway is you choose something at a young age and you just stick with that one activity throughout your whole life. And normally you would progress relatively quickly at a young age because you've put more hours in at a young age. But then what you often see is these athletes will plateau later on because they've done a lot of training early, and then eventually other athletes will catch up. The mixed ascent pathway, which is the green one, is more what we call early diversification. So participating in a number of different sports during childhood and early adolescence, then only specializing in your sport a bit later on, 15, 16, 17, and then continuing that develop in your chosen sport. And the mixed ascent pathway is what maybe where you start with one sport, for whatever reason, the athlete or the child doesn't enjoy that sport anymore. Maybe they have an injury, maybe there's other factors, they're not able to continue in that sport, and then they will transfer into a different sport and then continue their development in that other sport. We sometimes see that happen where an athlete will transfer between several different sports during the pathway. So I think generally in Singapore, we are quite strong on the linear ascent pathway. And what we've been doing at MYSI over the last 7 years together with sports schools is looking at ways to enhance these non-linear pathways to make sure that there are multiple opportunities for potentially talented athletes to enter the system. So next slide, please. So again, this is actually a mountain in China, and again, this probably illustrates this quite well. That there are numerous ways to get to the top of the mountain. Some are more straightforward than others. Some are a little bit more challenging. Some will be more direct. Some will be less direct. But ultimately, they will eventually get to the top of the mountain. And again, that's where we want to be very deliberate about making sure that we strengthen all three of these pathways, so that every student athlete coming through the system, no matter where their starting point is, no matter how their talent manifests, whether it's early or late, that there are these pathways for them to continue to progress. If we go on to the next slide, we give some examples. So for that pure ascent pathway, probably some of the more famous examples were, as I mentioned, Tiger Woods, who was on the television in the US at I think the age of 4 or 5 years old, sort of putting on a TV show, and people remember that because it's very unusual. Similarly, Andre Agassi, I know he specialized in tennis very young. His dad was very involved. So these athletes who started in their sport very young and specialized very early. But in both their cases, if you're familiar with their careers, they have had challenges throughout their careers. Like Tiger Woods obviously had numerous back injuries that have manifested later on in his career. And Andre Agassi has spoken quite a lot about some of the mental health issues that he's faced, which we feel were linked to the pressure that was put on him at a young age to specialize in the sport and perform at a high level. And we do have athletes locally as well. So Isabel Lee would be an example of an athlete who come through the sports school system, specialized very early, had success. She won a Youth Olympic Games medal, she won a SEA Games medal, but potentially didn't have the longevity in her career and retired comparatively young compared to perhaps where we would like her to get to. If we go to the next slide. So there we talk about this mixed ascent pathway. So again, this is where we talk about having that slightly more diversified experience earlier on, and then specializing a bit later. So as mentioned, Roger Federer is a good example of that. He didn't really have that much interest in tennis at a younger age. He actually wanted to be a footballer. He wanted to play for Bayern Munich. And it was only later on when he realized he wasn't going to make it as a footballer that he did focus a bit more of attention on tennis, and obviously progressed very quickly once he made that transition. Interestingly is the story of Lee Chun Wei. So he, again, wasn't very interested in badminton as a child. He actually wanted to play basketball, and he was playing basketball throughout most of his early childhood. And it's actually his mum who didn't want him to play basketball anymore because he thought the other children were a bad influence on him. So he only started playing badminton at 11 years old, and then obviously progressed through there. So you think maybe in our context, would that equivalent child be excluded from the system because they hadn't been playing badminton from the age of 4 or 5 years old? So in this example of why we want to make sure we do have these multiple pathways. So for those athletes who come into the system later, who are very talented, we can still provide them with a pathway to develop. And again, using a local example of Martina Veloso, a student athlete from the sports school. At a young age, she did taekwondo and athletics, and she only picked up shooting because she was picked up for a talent identification program run by the sports school, and then was put into a learn to shoot program. And she, from starting shooting effectively at set 1, 2 years later, she'd already won a senior world championship medal. And then after that, she had won Commonwealth Games medal, SEA Games medal. So this just goes to show that you don't need necessarily to have those 10,000 hours of development. If you have a strong movement base and you're put into the sport that fits your characteristics well, you can actually develop very quickly. And that's what we've seen in this case. And then if you go on to the final slide around this is where we talk about talent transfer. So the example on the left is maybe a slightly extreme example. Is Rebecca Romero, who's an athlete from the UK. So she won a silver medal in the 2004 Olympics in rowing, then decided that she sort of had enough of that. She wanted to try something different. Then she came back 4 years later in the 2008 Olympics in cycling, and then won gold medal there. So she had made that decision to make a transfer from her sport, and then within a comparatively short space of time, she was able to go on to be obviously an Olympic champion. And 2 examples from our system. So the first would be Constance Lien, who went through the sports school system as a swimmer. After leaving sports, she decided that she wanted to try something different, so dropped out of swimming, picked up Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and then a couple of years later was able to go on and win a medal at the Asian Games. And finally, at the bottom, we have Shemaine Tung, who was in the shooting academy at the Singapore Sports School. Upon leaving sports school, she went on to do something different. So she was doing kayaking for a while, and then eventually made her way into modern pentathlon, which is a sport which combines basically 5 different disciplines. And then 3 of those disciplines make up an event where you do shooting, running, and swimming. And she went on to win a world championship medal in that event. So again, these are examples of athletes who have gone through the pathway and changed sports 1 or 2 times to find a sport which both meets their physical characteristics, but also their area of interest, so that they really sort of commit to that sport, and because it's something that they're very passionate about, can develop very quickly. And as we've seen here, go on to be successful at the world stage. To the next slide, please. So how do we create this multi-sport environment? So in the Netherlands, they look at something called this athletic skills model, and they basically have 2 models of doing this. So the first one at the top would be your early engagement model, and that's maybe similar to what we'd have with existing academies at the Singapore Sports School, where you're selected onto the program primarily for one sport. So you'd come in as a swimmer or track and field athlete or a badminton athlete, and that takes up the bulk of your training. But then what we can do is add in other attributes of adaptive training, donor sports, and multi-sports. I'll explain these in a bit more detail later on, to make sure we get that holistic development of the athletes. So they're not just being developed solely in their one sport, they do have that wider movement base to call upon. Adaptive training is what we'd maybe term, you could call it like gymnastics type training, or training that is building movement characteristics which are important for the sport. So rather than just training in the primary sport, we're building other movement competencies which can then be transferred into that sport. Similarly for donor sports, where we're looking at different skills that may be transferable from one sport to another. So say, for example, if we wanted to teach spatial awareness in, for example, football, we could use another field evasion sport like basketball for a while to teach that those elements of spatial awareness. So that's where the skills developed in one sport can then be transferred across to a different sport. And then multi-sport is more about, again, that holistic development, making sure that athletes have a wide range of movement competencies, that they're able to move in different directions, they're able to jump and land without risk of injury. Because obviously if an athlete does get injured, then that will halt their development until they've recovered. So what we want to do is create robust athletes who are less likely to get injured, so they can have a more seamless development pathway. So for model 2, we talk about this idea of early diversification, and that's where at the early stages, you don't specialize in one sport, where you will do several sports at the same time, developing a wide repertoire of skills before then transferring to a sport where you specialize in. And then what we would see there is the development will be faster in that chosen sport, because the athlete has spent more time in developing those wide range of skills at a younger age. So what we might see is an athlete who specializes early will obviously be ahead of the non-specialized athlete at an early stage, but eventually when the non-specialized athlete does specialize, because they have that wider movement competency, what we will see is their development will be much more rapid, and they will quite quickly catch up or potentially even overtake the athlete who is specialized earlier. I think a way to think about this is in education, where no matter how talented a student is in maths, for example, we would still require them to do other subjects. We still require them to do English, science, mother tongue, because we recognize these are important for their overall development. But then when they go to JC or poly or university, then they would specialize. But because they've had that wide grounding in the various subjects, it allows them then to develop once they get to that later stage of education. So that's a similar concept here with this early diversification model. And next slide, please. And again, so this is what we're looking to set up here at Sports School. So we're not discounting the original model, because there are still student athletes who this will be an ideal fit for them, coming in, specializing in one sport, but still having those opportunities to be more holistic developed will be a good fit for certain student athletes. And we do not want to discount that more linear pathway. But what we want to do is strengthen that non-linear pathway by giving student athletes who maybe haven't had the opportunities in certain sports, or maybe have a wide range of interest, haven't found the sport that's really a good match for them, to come into the sports school environment, experience a number of different sports, build a much wider repertoire of skills, and then specialize in one sport a little bit later on, and then have their hopefully a more accelerated development within that sport. Okay, next slide. Okay. I think I'll pass back over to Mike now, who'll talk a little bit more about the program of the Multisport Academy.
Thanks, Matthew. Parents, I think we have been just looking some of the Q&A as questions as well. I think quite a number of the questions are actually related to what are the sports that we are offering in the Multisport Academy program. So, as I mentioned earlier, and I think what Matthew has shared, we actually are, for the Multisport Academy, we are adopting a more non-linear pathway for the child to develop in sports. And therefore, the focus actually, as I mentioned earlier, is really on the skills that is actually developed through the sports, and not so much on the sport itself. So therefore, I think after a bit of research and of discussion with the various stakeholders, and these are the sports that actually we will be offering in the Multisport Academy. Okay, so it is athletics, track and field, 3-on-3 basketball, as well as sport climbing. And this actually will be supported by a customized strength and conditioning program, where actually, because we know that to be able to, since we're focusing on skills, the core focus on strength and conditioning, it becomes even more prominent, to make sure that they have the necessary developed muscles correctly, they don't get injured as they develop. Okay, so really it is focusing on building upon their already strong fundamentals into movement patterns, and all these skills will actually aid them in the later stage, where they've essentially specialized in one sport at a later stage, and these skills actually help them to transfer between the sports. Okay. So the next slide, okay, here they will actually show you a little bit more of it. So when we break it down, why these 3 sports, you might ask. So it really comes down to what are the skills, the components of the skills actually they each of these sports afford. So you'll see that athletics. I think many of you may have heard this term that athletics or track and field is the mother of all sports, because through the athletics program, actually you are exposed, of course, you are exposed to the runs, the jumps, and the throws. So if you are able to participate in all 3, actually you have a good overall motor skills. But other things like, for example, 3-on-3 basketball then offers additional dimension, agility, a team-based sports where the communication and contact is actually much more prominent, prevalent in the team sports such as 3-on-3 basketball, and it's fast-paced, unlike a traditional larger team sports, for instance. And of course, the part about sport climbing, then it comes down to back again the focus really on your core strength, on as you balance, for example, when you climb up the wall, these are all the things, the elements of the skills that actually comes into play a lot more. And the last 2 actually is more on strength and conditioning, the traditional weights kind of training, which actually still features to slowly build strength, whereas the adaptive skills training, where, for example, there's certain gymnastic movement like tumbling, or perhaps even what we call free running movements, actually those actually help to provide the child, for example, the ankle twisting elements. So essentially through this program that we are developing, then offering to your child, they will be able to build up this repertoire of skills that will actually help them in the transfer much later on. So perhaps as an illustration of how the program will work. So essentially what happens is that it's not that the child will choose one of the three. Instead, when the child comes in, they actually have to participate in all three sports, sort of like a seasonal program. You might have heard that certain, for example, in the Western countries, they actually have seasons, imposed seasons because of the weather. There's a winter season and a summer season. And a lot of athletes that you've seen earlier, sometimes they play one sport or two sports in the summer, and then they switch to another sport in the winter. So having, similarly, I think what we're trying to develop is actually a similar program where it's seasonal in nature. So for instance, for the first third or quarter of the year, the student will actually be trained in athletics program. And that's when they'll be started to introduce the intensity of the program will be ramped up to about 4 to 5 times training a week in athletics through the various events, the runs, jump, and throws to build and strengthen their already good base. Then this time allows them to also hone the skills and internalize the learnings, build the muscle memory before they move on, for example, to the team-based sports, the 3-on-3 basketball, where some of the skills that they pick up, like for example, the strength, the stamina they develop in the athletics will then spill over to the basketball program. And that's when they continue to train for the 3 to 4 months in basketball. Finally, coming to the last part of the year, then they will switch again to sport climbing. And throughout this year, as I mentioned, strength conditioning becomes a very, very critical element where it has to be supported. The load of the child will have to be monitored, especially when they transit from one sport to another. And that's when actually we work closely with NYSI, the coaches, the sports scientists to ensure that the program is with the child in mind. Okay? Of course, at appropriate junctures, the coaches will actually try to identify appropriate skills or age-appropriate competitions for your child so that they have a chance, opportunity to test their skills. Okay? So what does a path in sports school look like for a multi-sport academy? So perhaps before I shared on the center path, actually you'll see that on the left, you will see the academy program, right? So that's where the traditional, when you join sports school, essentially throughout the lower set, upper set, and post set years in sports school, you are in, for instance, badminton, swimming, or even track and field, for instance, and you kind of specialize in that, continue to hone and develop your skills in that area. And that is the linear pathway that I think Matthew mentioned earlier. So for the Multisport Academy, what it will look like is that you will, for the lower set years, especially set 1, set 2, you will continue training in the 3 sports which I mentioned. And as you go up into upper set, that's when your pathway become a bit more diversified. To say, hey, I have the skills already. So where do I go next? Do I want to specialize and talent optimize into one particular sport? And this one sport could be in the 3, which I mentioned, athletics, basketball, or sport climbing. I may find certain interest or certain strength in that area that we should say, hey, from now on, I actually want to specialize in that one sport and continue in that path. Okay, sure, you can do that. Of course, if you treat it that, hey, actually, I'm still not ready, I'm not sure, the coaches will assess that together with the child and say, perhaps in the upper set, that's when we start to streamline and focus down. Instead of 3 sports, I now need to focus and move towards high performance. And that's when we say, hey, perhaps I now streamline to focus on 2. At this moment, of course, we have not identified those 2. It could be one of the 3 that actually has developing in the lower set. But again, the focus is on skills. But again, at any point, you'll see similarly when they go up the post-sec, when they go through a true train pathway to our post-secondary programs, similarly, they will continue training in multiple sports. And at any juncture, there will be talent optimization opportunities where they can move into a particular and specialize in a particular sport, in one sport. And that's when actually, rest assured that as long as once they join sports school, we will work closely with the parents, with the NYSI, with the NSA, as well as the coaches especially, to then plot out the path and monitor the child as they progress progress through their journey. Right, so who are we looking for? Okay, some of you asked, do I need to be the best runner now? Must I have certain achievements in medals in national school in athletics or in basketball or perhaps even in sport climbing at this stage? At this stage, no, what we are really looking for is for good movers. And I mean, I use this term, some of you may ask what does good mover means. So essentially this referring to students who actually have a lot of, essentially they are a very active outdoor person. They enjoy being out, for example, running about, playing badminton, playing perhaps even gymnastics, playing basketball. Essentially, they love being out there in the sun, running, moving, and enjoying physical activity in general. And it's good that actually they have prior exposure and experience in multiple sports. For example, they could be taking currently a CCA in school. That's their so-called perhaps their core sport currently. They could be taking some other sports, for example, perhaps even shooting or badminton on the weekends, playing with friends, playing with in clubs, or some classes with Active SG, for instance. So the idea is that the multiple skills that they actually develop through exposure in multiple sports actually helps them, put them in a good state to strengthen and build their core fundamentals. And those are the kind of students that actually we are looking for. But I think beyond the skills, the experience and attributes, what we're looking for is this motivation and attitude. I think this is actually very important. I mean, we should emphasize here that actually this is what we're offering in sports school, Multisport Academy. It's not so much a learn to play. It is really for students who really aspires to be a national athlete in someday. And they are willing to take the non-linear pathway to success. That means at this stage, perhaps as a child, and the child actually does say, hey, I'm not so sure what I really want to achieve, or what I want to specialize in. I'm not so sure I want to just train in track and field, train in badminton, or train in certain sports. But I'm willing to explore and say that perhaps I just want to represent the country in one of the sports eventually. Show me how to get there. And that's why I think this will form the best fit for the child then, to say we focus on building your strengths, building your skills. Eventually, once we, through a process of mentoring and development, we say, hey, actually, you may be more suited for instance, hey, I think you're quite suited for sport climbing, that's specialized, and focus on that, and then you continue your next step of the journey in that particular sport. Or you may even transfer to say, hey, maybe I want to switch to cycling. We have actually, as what Matthew mentioned earlier, there are success cases where student athletes who say that because they're used to the level of training, the intensity of training in sports school, once they switch, they already have the athletic mindset and the growth mindset to say that, hey, actually, I can do what I want to achieve as long as I put my mind to it. And that's when their development in the sport of choice will actually be it will be accelerated when they finally specialize. Of course, wanting to manage parents' expectations as well, and also to manage expectations on the child, to recognize that because you're taking a non-linear pathway, achievements, you may not be, say, hey, in Sec 1, I already will be able to medal in national school games, for instance, right from Sec 1, Sec 2. They must be patient and say that work with the coaches and says, I will take a slightly longer path to see actual translation into medals. But this does not mean that we kind of, in a way, we just need to define what the success means. Success in terms of medals will not come so early, it will come later, but keep at it, be resilient, and I think eventually they will achieve what they are looking out for. Okay, so at this stage, I think I will take more questions on this later on during the Q&A. Okay, so now this is roughly what the selection process is going to be about. Don't worry, we'll send the information to you also by email after this session, so don't need to worry here. So currently today, we are at this stage of parents engagement session where we share a bit more details about the sports that we offer. For the selection trials, we actually are going to do a selection trial where we will assess the students' athletes' physical abilities and coordination skills. And this will be done either on the 10th or 25th. Okay, I'll share more on the next slide. And this, we actually, because even though I know some of you may have already attended trials for other sports, you're also welcome to still come for this. There's no, I mean, because what we're trying to assess is not so much a sport-specific skills, but rather your overall motor and coordination skills. And those that are shortlisted will then move on to the next subsequent stages where we'll shortlist further and say perhaps now come for situational assessment test, engagement where we'll really find out the right suitability, right fit, whether your child and parents and school really find the best fit for the child, and that will come at a later stage. So immediately at the stage 2, and that's what we are looking out for. I put a QR code here. Don't hurry to sign up yet. The link is not yet live. I will send out the link again also via email later to all of you, so you can actually sign up later on. But essentially, you can choose to attend one of the sessions for the selection trials, knowing that I know it's a June holidays, but do take time to see whether your child can attend either of the session, or if you can't, just drop an email to me, and my contact details will be on the last slide. Then we'll discuss further from there. Okay. So perhaps now, I know some of you a lot of questions. We see a lot of questions coming in. I'll perhaps hand over the time over to my colleague to moderate the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mike and Matthew, for the information. Now, parents, you have keyed in lots of very good questions, of which some by now you would have actually got the answers from the presentation itself. Nonetheless, there remain some questions to be addressed, and with us is a panel. And a quick introduction to the panelists. Panelists, as you enable your video, I'm sure you have also picked out some questions, and I will direct some questions to your kind selves. Okay. Now, with us, parents, we have got our principal, Mr. Ong Kim Soon. We have Ms. Tan Bee Lian, Director of Sports. You have heard him, Mr. Matthew James Wild. You have also heard Mr. Mike Goh. And also, we have got from NYSI as well, Dr. Esther Chia. She's looking after talent identification. Now, among all the questions, the first I would like to direct to Dr. Esther Chia is a concern from parents that they have got children who are pretty general in their physical literacy, not specifically trained, and particularly not specifically trained in the 3 sports. Now, will that put them in a disadvantageous position when it comes to selection?
Yeah, thanks, Scott Wei, for the question, posing that question. So as Mike had shared earlier on, the selection trials is essentially looking for individuals who have good and strong fundamental movement skills. And essentially what we'll be assessing will be things like physical attributes, which cover things, for example, like speed, power, agility, flexibility, etc. As well as coordination skills. So we've got assessment batteries that we have identified that are valid and reliable in assessing motor coordination skills that are relevant to high performance sports. So these will be the assessment tools that we're using for the selection trials. As for whether or not having prior participation in those sports is not important, because as I said, these assessment tools are general in nature and do not assess, and we are not looking specifically into the particular skills that are required for these 3 sports. So I hope that answers your question. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Chia, for a very concise and clear answer. Now, next question I would like to direct to Director of Sports, Ms. Tan Bee Lian. It is a highly upvoted question with regards to DSA. Now, if the children have already applied to another school, are they okay to also consider and apply for MSA under sports school? That's part number 1. Part 2 is quite a few of them had already registered with an academy sport in sports school, and they are currently either undergoing trials or they have already been rejected. What is their next step, please?
Okay, for parents, right? If you find that whatever that we have presented here is actually a suitable program for your child, do sign up for the selection trial. I think Mr. Mike Goh has mentioned earlier that the assessment that we are doing is actually quite specific for Multisport Academy. For the other academies, we are doing trials pertaining to their sports. So if you have not been selected for the other academies, obviously, if you're still interested in coming to sports school, do come for our trial. If you're not sure about whether or not you have been selected, do also come for the trial. Yeah, so that amongst within the team ourselves, we do actually look at the overall applicants coming into sports school. So if you are looking into DSA to other schools, I think that's a decision that you have to make. You know about the DSA timeline. So I believe the DSA interview will probably be ongoing, probably from June or July onwards. So do come in with the submission only when you decide that you are going for DSA into other schools. Then once you have accepted DSA into other schools, then the acceptance to sports school will be voided. Yeah. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you, Ms. Tan Billion. That's very clear. Yeah. Next question is directed at Mr. Matthew. It's about the programming of MSA, Multisports. Are post-secondary students eligible? And if not, why so?
At this juncture, we are starting, because it's a new academy, we're starting with the Set 1 intake. So specifically for the Multisport Academy, we will be starting with that at this point. I think we envisage later on, once the academy has become more mature, then we will be able to start taking in students as midstream intake. I think at this juncture, we would focus on the Set 1 intake first. However, I think if there are students who are interested in coming into a sport later on in their journey, there are already programs in place for that. So obviously the Singapore Sports School do take midstream applicants for their academy. So if there is a student who has a strong skill set within a particular sport, they can obviously explore that avenue. Also, NYSI, we do have what we call a talent optimization program. So that's looking at students who maybe are post-secondary, who have gone through their journey. Maybe they've done a CCA in a certain sport. They've reached the end of their secondary school career, and then they're looking to move into a different sport. So then what we do is we'd help them find a sport that does meet their physical characteristics and their interests, and then try and help them develop in that sport. Some of that obviously could potentially be within the sports school environment. Some of it might be external to that. We do work with a number of the national sport associations to offer those talent optimization programs for students who are at that juncture where they've maybe reached as far as they can in their regional sport, and they're looking for a new challenge and new sport to move into.
Thanks for that answer, Matthew. The next one, perhaps Mr. Mike Goh can take this. It's about children who are already into some specific sports, but not quite at the national youth level. Example, sailing, archery, even netball. Can they apply for MSA, number one? And number two, can they have a continuity of their current sport as part of the MSA?
Okay, thanks, Wei. So for what I mentioned earlier, that for this multi-sport program, because we are really focusing on the skills, and we will be designing a sort of customized program for them. So through the sports, actually, all the students who join the multi-sport academy would have to go through this program of the athletics, basketball, as well as sport climbing. So if a child, so it's expect that actually the child will actually be out of perhaps 4 to 5 days a week of training. They will be training in this sport within the Multisport Academy at sports school. Then perhaps if a child still has very strong interest and passion in, for example, sailing or other programs, they might want to consider doing that over the weekend. But I want to that's why we actually need to work quite closely with the parents, because we also know that especially at a student at that age, we don't want to overload them, because we know that coming from sports, right, where they are in primary school, their level of training, intensity of training may not be that high. But once they come to sports school, we'll start to gradually scale up the training. So we want to make sure that the students we don't overload the students with too many activities as well. But so essentially, what if a child is still interested to pursue, for example, in a particular sport, perhaps I say, if you think that Multisport Academy is suited for them, then follow the program, our program. But if you think that perhaps, I think he's still quite focused on just his one sport, and perhaps he wants to take on another sport as more of like a hobby, then perhaps we could you could advise the child, perhaps that could be a better path for your child. Yeah.
Thanks, Mike, for the clear answer. I'd like to invite principal. There are some questions on the Q&A that people will touch on as well. That includes subject-based banding and where sports schools stand in that. What do we look out for in the students in general, and what do we pick out during selection interviews? And a question asked, does sports school take the sport like a CCA in a mainstream school? Mr. Ong, principal, please.
Yeah, thanks, Kok-Wei. Good morning, parents. I'm glad you could join us this morning. But looking through the question, I note that parents may have a little bit, some parents may have a bit of misunderstanding regards to what this multi-sports academy is about. If I can attempt to say, it is a totally different concept. In other words, you're not coming into sports school under the multi-sports academy to do to pursue specifically these 3 sports per se. All right. So conceptually, these 3 sports are selected primarily because of the affordances of these sports to provide for your child's overall athletic skills development. So don't think of it as I'm coming in for 3-on-3 basketball, or I'm coming in for athletics, or I'm coming in for rock climbing. That is not the point. The sports itself is a means to develop those athletic skills development. Of course, having said that, if your child subsequently became very interested in one of these 3 sports or other sports, right, your child can then specialize and pursue one of these 3 or other sports, right, and specialize in that. So I hope parents get that idea. That is a big conceptual difference, right? So I hope that will then help to answer the rest of some of the other questions, when you think about multi-sports academy. So if it's still not clear, then take time to mull over it. And then when the material is sent out, continue to clarify. Okay. So you're not coming in for 3-on-3 basketball per se, like I said. All right. Okay. Then back to some of the specific questions, therefore. Full subject-based banding. Actually, the school is already on subject-based banding, meaning that our child who comes in with normal technical, for the normal technical course, some of our students are already taking NA subject. So they could be taking NA Mother Tongue, NA English, NA Mathematics, right? Or even NA Science. So depending on the child's academic ability for those subjects, sports school already offer subject-based banding. Officially, we say we will be on full subject-based banding following MOE timeline 2024. But like I say, even today, we are already subject-based banded. So if your child has some subject that he's able to do at a higher level, right, despite the course that he or she is posted to, your child can pursue those subjects, right? So that's an assurance to you. A related question, therefore, is about the AL cutoff, right, that I saw in the Q&A. Now, the school does not have a AL cutoff, not because it's a lousy school, right? Parents tend to associate the concept of AL cutoff with the quality of students you take in. It doesn't happen for sports school. Sports school takes in sports school takes in children who are passionate about sports. And therefore, the AL cutoff is not a cutoff criteria, right? I say that again. Because our criteria is sports-centric, and we are able to cater to the entire range of stream academic ability. Therefore, there's no AL cutoff. Now, if you're interested in our past historical record, for your information, this year's Sec 1 cohort, for example, right, we have kids who come in with AL5, essentially meaning that all the subjects are AL1 except 1, right? So you get 1, 1, 1, right, and a 2, right, all the way to AL28. So we are able to cater to the full range of academic ability. And how we do it, Mr. Mike Goh earlier had explained how, right, through our small class size, right, we are able to then look after your kids a lot more carefully, right, and help them in their academic learning. But please don't come to sports school because you only value this small class size and academic learning, right? Like I always tell parents, if you're looking for good schools, there are a good 100 over, good schools out there. But if your child is passionate about sports, then this is probably the right place. Okay, so I hope that sort of answers a little bit of parents' concern about, oh, which sports, can I choose this? And then is it like a CCA? Well, it's not, right? Sports in sports school is not a CCA. Sports in sports school is part of the curriculum. And that's the reason why they spend a lot of time on it, right? They spend 4 to 5 days training. And for some specialized sports, they even train twice a day. So they could train up to 8 to 9 times in a week. So that is what sports school is about. So I hope that helps parents understand a little bit. Some related question, therefore, has to do with boarding. Boarding is not mandatory, right? Boarding is a means of support for your child, like what Mr. Mike Goh shared earlier. It helps the child better manage the time. So you can study here, you train here, right? You rest here, you sleep here. And of course, weekend you go back, right? Weekend you go back. So it is not mandatory, but it is certainly helpful for those who want to better manage their time. Okay. A sort of related question, sorry, Mr. Ng, don't mind, I'll just pick up a few which I thought parents are concerned. Then it's to do with the school fees. Okay? Our school fees are expensive compared to the mainstream school. But if you compare us to a any other independent school, actually our school fees is cheap because we are very heavily subsidized. School fees is comparable to a mainstream independent school, right? But for the services, for the range of services that your child receives, right, I would say it is really cheap. We're heavily subsidized because we are not only funded by MOE for your education, we're also funded by MCCY, right, for your sports development. Okay, and therefore there's another question about whether there's different school fees. No, there's only one school fees regardless of the sports academy. Okay, I hope I answer most of all these questions. Yeah, Mr. Ng, did I miss out anything? Okay, never mind. You can come back to me again.
Very comprehensive.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry, Mr. Ng. There was a question earlier you asked me about the interview criteria, right? So don't worry about interview. Interview is a platform for us to get to know your child. Why is it kind of like placed at the end? Because we really want to look at the sports competency first. So we are not testing your child on basketball, rock climbing, and athletics. We're not testing them on those specific sports. Like what Dr. Chia has explained earlier, right? We're testing the child on a range of athletic ability and skills. And then from there, we also then have, if you saw just now, the timeline and all the activities we put your child through, is really to get to know your child. And then eventually at the interview, our purpose is to know your child and let your child have a chance to speak for himself or herself why he or she wants to come to sports school. So it's for us to get to know your child and what motivates him or her, right? So that we can find a good fit, right? So don't look at interview as if like a pass-fail thing. Interview is really about finding a good fit, right, between us and your child and us. So it's as much a decision for us to decide whether or not to take your child as it is for your child and yourself to decide whether you should join a sports school. Okay, I hope that clarifies the interview and interview criteria a bit. Right, back to you, Mr. Ng.
Thank you, Mr. Ong, and all panelists for comprehensive answering and sum up. Now, what happens after this is a recording of the session will be sent to all attendee parents. And for further queries that you may still have, Mr. Mike Goh is available. You would have his contact by now through the invites. And once again, on behalf of the school and NYSI, we thank all attendees on this Saturday morning, and we wish you health and a good weekend ahead. Thank you, everybody.